Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I am redecorating my wooden dollhouse. So these are wooden doll rooms. I got them off of Etsy, and when I originally got them, Dad helped me to glue them together, and then we just did that without bothering with any painting or anything like that. I think in part because I was very excited just to put them together, and partly because I probably didn't know what exactly I was going to use the rooms for at the time. But now after over a year, I am ready to finally do something with the walls and floors. However, I don't want it to be permanent. Usually when I do something more permanent in my dollhouses, like any wooden furniture that I've put together and painted, I go with a neutral color, specifically white. And as a result, most of the furniture in my dollhouse is white, and my inclination if I was to paint these rooms would be to go with white walls, and well, that's just a little too much white even for me. So here's the idea that I came up with to make temporary wallpaper using poster board and scrapbook paper. I started out by measuring the floors and the walls and cutting my poster board to those sizes. This was really easy for the floor and the center back wall because they were pretty much just rectangles. It was a little harder on those side walls because there's this brace that goes across the front of the wall that kind of gets in the way. So what I had to do with that is, in addition to the measurements of the wall itself, I had to measure how far down that brace went as well as how far back it went, and then I just cut a notch out. Once I had all of these cut out to the appropriate sizes, I then used the first one to trace all the other ones I needed. And I cut 3 for the center back wall, 3 for the floors, and then 4 for the side walls, which was 2 for either of the lower doll rooms. For the tops here, I put the cutting out the side walls off until later because they had a different shape and I just didn't want to mess with it at the beginning of this project. So now you can see how the poster board fits into the room. The next step was covering it with scrapbook paper. I'm going to go over this room by room, starting with the middle room, which is the master bedroom and the nursery. So for the floor of this room, I chose a scrapbook paper with a wood board print, and I just attached it to the poster board using a tape runner. And I did that because 1, it's faster, and 2, I didn't want to risk using glue and having everything warp. So I found it easiest just to start in a corner and put down a whole sheet of scrapbook paper and keep doing that across the length until I ran out of room. And then I would just piece together the edges by cutting the paper down to the size that I needed. So this is the only room that doesn't have mostly white furniture. Most of the furniture is brown, and of course the centerpiece is the 4-poster bed with that light blue blanket. To me, it has always given that room a slightly more ornate feel to it, and so when I saw this blue and gold scrapbook paper, I knew I had to use it for the center back wall. Now, my tape runner didn't work on this paper, so instead of using that, I just used scrapbook paper dots, like the adhesive dots, or squares actually. They work the same as the tape runner, they're just a lot slower because you have to place all of the dots individually. And I just covered the poster board for the back wall the same way I did for the floor, doing whole sheets and then coming back in with other pieces around the edges. And I did find that sometimes it was easier to cut the scrapbook paper just a little bigger and then just trim it off based on the back, like flip it upside down and trim off the excess. Before I could cover the side walls, I did have one more step I needed to do for one of them. So one of the side walls in this room has a window cutout, and I wanted to keep that. So what I did was I placed the paper board that was going to go on that wall into the doll room and placed a large piece of furniture behind it. I then went to the other side and traced the cutout onto the paperboard, and then used an X-Acto knife to cut out those pieces. As for what I actually covered those walls, and I didn't want to use the blue scrapbook paper. I felt that that was going to make the room too dark and probably a little too busy as well. So that's remaining an accent wall, and I just used a light tan cardstock to cover the side walls. Now I will note here that I fully expected these walls not to stand up. My plan, I guess you could say, or best case scenario, was that I was going to put these into the doll rooms and then shove all of the furniture up against the walls to hold it up. But I was surprised to find that actually the side walls with the cardstock on them seemed to stand up in the rooms pretty well on their own, even without the furniture pressed up against them. Up next was the bottom room, which is the kitchen. Now, I had seen this stick-on wallpaper at Dollar Tree that I really would have liked to have used in this room, but by the time I was gathering my supplies for this project, they no longer had it. So instead, I decided to just make my own custom paper. So I started out by covering my poster board in a light green cardstock. Now this room does have a door cutout on one side wall, so I did open that up the same way I did with the window in the last room. And then after the poster board was covered in the cardstock, I took this flower stamp and stamped it onto the walls, trying to stagger them as well as change the angle that I had the stamp turned to as I went. And that was just to slightly vary up the pattern so that it wasn't just like all flowers going straight up and down. And this was a two-step stamp. So the first stamp was the color of the flower, and I used white ink for that. And then the second was the outline, which I used gray ink for. And for this room, I did cover all three walls in the same paper. The floor is the same as the previous room because I had extra sheets of paper from it, and because I couldn't find any like tile or anything else that I liked for this room. Finally, the top room. This is the girls' room, and the first thing I noticed was that the center back wall in this room is not the same size as the center back wall in the two lower rooms. Now, fortunately, it was shorter, which meant that I was able to just cut down the height of the wall to the appropriate size. As for those side walls, you recall that I did not cut out the poster board bases for these walls yet, because of the shape of them. So they are angled at the top to give the dollhouse that kind of typical sloped roof that you think of when you think of a house. And so cutting these out was a little more difficult. So what I ended up doing was I started by cutting a rectangle. The shorter side of the rectangle was the length of the house, length of that side wall. And then the long side of my rectangle was the height of the side wall at the tallest point, so at that peak. I then marked the center of the short side of my rectangle. That's where the peak is going to be. Then I measured from the bottom of my rectangle up to the height of the lowest point of the wall and made a mark at that measurement on both sides. I then measured from the mark on the side wall up to the mark in the center top at an angle and marked that, then cut it out. And I ended up with this. Yeah, so that's not quite right. To be clear, my method was correct, but my measurement that I had written down was wrong. So I had to actually recut one of my walls, this time using the correct measurement, and actually got the correct results. Now this room does have a door in one of the side walls, but since this is the top level and I don't have another set of stacking rooms to go to, it is literally just a door to nowhere. So I opted not to open up that door on my poster board. For this room, I used a pastel floral scrapbook paper, and I covered the lower half, or lower portion of the walls in that, and then just finished off the top in a light pink cardstock because I didn't want to try and piece together the printed paper up at the top. Now, because these walls were none covered completely in cardstock, they were still kind of flimsy. I had the same problem with the center back wall in the master bedroom. Now, I find that at the top floor, because there's no brace across the front and all of that, it's a little more obvious that that's the case. So I went ahead and covered the back of the poster board in cardstock. For the side walls, I actually did it in light pink cardstock, which will make sense in a second. And then for the center back wall, I did it in white cardstock. And then on top of the white cardstock, I went ahead and put another layer of scrapbook paper, this time this very small purple floral print. And this gave me reversible walls. And for the floor of this room, I used a herringbone wood print. This is a stick-on wallpaper from Dollar Tree. And even though it's stick-on, and I suppose I could have peeled the backing off and attached it to the poster board, I did opt to just attach it using the tape runner because I just find it easier than trying to finagle that whole sticky back if I was to peel it off. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.